Hello, welcome again. This is Poetry Lockdown Day 26. I'm delighted to be sharing a poem by Spencer Reece, a poet who I absolutely love, whose work has really shaped my understanding of poetry. So like a lot of my poetic adventures, this one began with my teacher Deborah Keenan when I was taking classes with her at Hamlin University. She saw that I was very much interested in the intersection between the imagination and matters of faith. And she said, "Hey, Zach, have you ever heard of this poet Spencer Reece? There's this long poem, The Road to Emmaus. I think you'd really like." I read it. I reread it again today. It's not gonna be the poem I share because it's a little long. Um, but it really shook me up and impressed me how the stories in the scriptures that, again, like I said, I'd read so many times, could be made fresh with language and with the imagination. So that poem I linked. I'm going to read a different poem, but I really recommend it. So because of our mutual teacher, Deborah Keenan, Spencer Reece has been generous enough to correspond with me a number of times over the years. And I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I really love your poem at Thomas Merton's grave. Before I read it, could you tell me a little bit about its inspiration?" So before I read it, I just want to share this with you from the poet. So he says, "This poem at Thomas Merton's grave was written from experience. 17 years ago, after my first book won the Bakeless Prize, I went out to Louisville and went on silent retreat to commune with Merton's spirit." Right, Thomas Merton, a famous Cistercian, I want to say, monk. If I get that wrong, I apologize. Wrote during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s on the spiritual life. He said, back to Reece, "My life in poetry has radically changed from being completely unknown to being known. My next book of poetry, The Road to Emmaus, came 11 years later, and it was important to me that it make a very different sound than the first. This poem began that new sound. It was a sound that was moving from damage to reconciliation. That would entail different formal experiments, as well as different material and subject matter. This poem served like the divining rod." All right, so that's a nice intro. And by the way, so the book that he mentioned that was like he went from being unknown to known. That's this one, "The Clerk's Tale." The opening poem, title poem, actually takes place in the Mall of America. So it's Minneapolis St. Paul, folks. Check it out. It's a great book, great poem. But I was just introducing at Thomas Merton's grave, so let me read that for you. "We can never be with loss too long. Behind the warped door that sticks, the wood thrush calls to the monks, pausing upon the stone crucifix, singing, 'I am marvelous alone.' Thrash, thrash goes the hayfield, rows of marrow and bone undone. The horizon's flashing fastens tight, sealing the blue hills with vermilion. Moss dyes a squirrel's skull green. The cemetery expands its borders. Little milky crosses grow like teeth. How kind time is, altering space, so nothing stays wrong. And light, more new light, always arrives." I love this poem. I love it for its visual quality. It's visually stunning, almost like a painting. And Spencer Reece, by the way, has great talent as a visual artist. But also for its quiet and its patience. I think one of the beautiful things about this poem is that essentially it seems to me a poem about insight, um, and about how it takes time to learn things about yourself. And I think Spencer Reece, as someone who, in the Clerk's Tale, is working at Mall of America, I think of Brooks Brothers, and then now has stepped into a role as an Episcopalian priest. That was a journey, that was a process, and I think his poem speaks to how that process unfolds over time, quietly. And I like the image of, I think it's a sunrise, if I'm understanding this, sealing the blue hills with vermilion. That is kind of how a vocation, a life's passion unfolds, oftentimes quietly, and it takes time. Those last lines speak to that, how kind time is, altering space so nothing stays wrong, and light, more new light, always arrives. So to me, this poem really speaks to, as a poet and an artist, showing up, right? Being patient and allowing the vision to come to you and not always grasping after it, which can be tempting, especially when the vision doesn't come the way that you wanted to or when you wanted to. So that's my takeaway from this beautiful poem. I'm sure when I read it again in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, it will probably mean something different to me. But I'll read it one last time. At Thomas Merton's grave. We can never be with loss too long. Behind the warped door that sticks, the wood thrush calls to the monks, pausing upon the stone crucifix, singing, I am marvelous alone. Thrash, thrash goes the hayfield, rows of marrow and bone undone. The horizon's flashing fastens tight, sealing the blue hills with vermilion. Moss dyes a squirrel's skull green. The cemetery expands its borders. Little milky crosses grow like teeth. How kind time is, altering space so nothing stays wrong. And light, more new light, always arrives. Thank you, Spencer, Reece, and thank you all for tuning in.